Hello everybody and welcome back. In this episode I want to talk about the fact that in JavaScript almost everything has a value and every value has a thing called a data type. Primarily we're going to be talking about things called variables, literals, and expressions. Variables and literals are things that we've actually discussed previously, so hopefully by this point you have a working idea of what those two things are. Literals of course are what we usually refer to as hard-coded values. Strings inside quotes, hard-coded numbers, things of that nature. A literal is basically a value in and to itself. Variables, on the other hand, of course, are names that represent memory locations in which values can be stored. So literals and variables are very related, especially in the fact that they both represent a value. A literal represents a value very literally, whereas a variable kind of more abstractly or more indirectly represents a particular value. I want to introduce you now to another concept called expressions. Expressions are basically a special type of JavaScript statement. What we have here is a variety of different statements, very much like statements that we've played with before in our previous examples. Var first name we know declares a variable called first name. Document.writeLine hello, the string constant hello will append or add the string hello to the output that becomes a part of our web page, our document. First name equals the string constant Victrola, string literal Victrola, I'm sorry. Of course, we'll assign that string literal to the first name variable, so the value of the first name variable will be equal to Victrola. First name equals prompt, what is your name? Of course, we'll pop up a box that will allow the user to fill in a value, which will then be assigned to the first name variable, stored in the memory location that the first name variable refers to. And then the very last one there is just the first name variable all by itself, not inside quotes. So when the first name variable is used that way, JavaScript understands that we're simply talking about the value of that particular variable. Now, even though these are all basically JavaScript statements, two of them are of one type and three of them are of the other. The first two we have here, the variable declaration and the document.writeLine statement, are both exactly that. They're just simply statements. What it is that actually makes them statements is the fact that neither one of them actually represents a value. If you were to say, for example, do a document.writeLine var first name inside the document.writeline's parentheses, it would cause an error because there is no value produced by declaring a variable. Same basic thing would happen with the document.writeLine statement. The last three statements we have here are all what we would call expressions. They are expressions because each one of those statements themselves actually represents a value. When we do first name equals Victrola, what we would find is that the value of that entire statement is actually the assigned value, Victrola. Same basic thing with the prompt. The prompt statement, the first name equals prompt statement, would actually be equal, the entire statement, to whatever value the user fills into the prompt box. And of course the last one is really in a lot of ways the simplest. The first name variable by itself is simply an expression that means the value of this variable. So, literals and expressions are also very closely related. Literals and expressions both have a value, or both produce or represent a value in one way or another. Because they have a value, they also have a thing called a data type. Variables are also closely related to those two. They also have a value and thus a data type, but variables are a little bit more complicated. We already know that variables, in addition to the value and the data type, also have a name, the actual name of the variable that we make up, that we use in our code whenever we want to talk about the value that it's storing. We'll also find out in later episodes that variables also have a thing called a scope and a lifetime. But for right now, I just want to talk specifically about data types. Data types are something that we have with literals, with expressions, with variables. Anywhere there's a value, there's going to be a data type. What a data type basically is a way of classifying data, of taking data and breaking it up into different groups. What is it that what it is that makes a particular value fall into a particular data type is what the value actually is, what values can be expressed. Some of the different data types that we'll deal with initially are called primitive data types. They're sort of the simplest of the data types. The primitive data types that we'll work with in JavaScript are the string, the number, the Boolean, and the undefined data types. A lot of these we've actually run into before, and it's pretty easy to imagine how particular values will fall into one of these different categories, or data types. Anytime we have a series of characters inside single or double quotes, that's considered to be a string, so we would say its data type is string. Anytime we have a number, of course its data type is number. Boolean is anytime we have a value that's true or false. It's really in a lot of ways one of the simplest data types because it can only possibly be those two values. And the last primitive data type I have listed here is kind of a strange one, the undefined, which we've run into a few times before. The undefined data type is simply the data type that's assigned to a variable when no other data type is present. We'll find out later that in addition to those 4 primitive data types, JavaScript also has a couple of complex data types, which are kind of a step above in complication and using and understanding them. The complex data types we have in JavaScript are the object type and the function type, which we will talk about individually later. The reason it's important for us to understand data types in JavaScript is that JavaScript is what is called a loosely typed or a weakly typed language. Some programming languages require that any variable that's created be assigned a data type, and from that point forward, any value that is put into that variable must be of that particular type. JavaScript doesn't work that way, however. With JavaScript, any variable can hold any value. Like in the 3 lines of code I have here, if we think about it from the data type perspective, when we first do var x, basically declaring a variable called x, we don't assign a value to it, so at that time, when the variable is first declared, its data type is undefined. In the next statement, when we say x equals the string literal hello, what happens at that point is that when we assign a literal with the data type of string to that variable's data type then becomes string, so it changes from undefined to string based on the value that's in the variable. The third statement then, when we assign a value of 9 to the variable, again changes its data type. This time it changes to the numeric or the number data type. So in these 3 statements, the variable x goes through basically 3 changes, from non-existence to undefined, from undefined to string, and then from string to number. So its data type changes a number of times, which is one of the things that happens frequently in loosely typed languages like JavaScript. A lot of people like loosely typed languages just because of the kind of convenience you get from being able to reuse variables in this way, basically put into them whatever it is you feel like putting into them. But loosely typed languages do put a lot of confidence in the programmer because it assumes that the programmer is going to understand data types and be able to work with them correctly. The reason we really need to understand this is because there are going to be different statements, different operators, different expressions that we will write that will react differently based on what the actual data type of a variable is. So we'll take a look at that next in an example. Alright, let's take a look at an example, a simple little program, or at least it'll seem that way on the surface, where the data type of our values and variables actually are going to make a tremendous difference. What I want this little example to do is I basically want to use the prompt statement to ask the user to enter 2 different numbers. Then I simply want to take those 2 numbers, I want to add them together and show them what the sum is. So I'm going to start here in the body of my document by putting in a set of script tags. Basically what the steps are that I need to go through is that I need to declare a variable to hold the first number the user puts in. So let me say var num1, and I'm going to assign to that variable the value that's returned when the user types in a value in a prompt statement. So the actual prompt itself, I'm going to say, is enter the first number. There we go. The next step I'm going to need, the second thing that I'm going to want the user to do, is to enter a second number. So I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call this one num2. And again, I'm going to use a prompt statement, and I'm going to ask the user to enter the second number. At that point, I've gathered the 2 numbers that are needed to be able to perform my calculation. So there's a few ways I could go about this next part. Let's start by doing var total, creating a total variable, and then I'm going to assign to the total variable the sum that I get from taking num1 and adding to it num2. Now, of course, when I say num1 and num2 there, I'm referring to the values that are stored in those areas of the computer's memory that are stored in those two variables. So those two values, basically the values that the user entered, should be added together and then stored in the total variable. The only thing left for the program to then do is to produce some output, actually show the user what the sum is. So I think I'll use an alert for this. What I'm going to do here in the alert is I'm going to say the total, actually let's say the sum of num1 and num2 is, and then we'll display the total. Right? So I'm putting together a string here. The first part, the sum of, is a string literal, so it will be kept just the way it is, but then I will append to that the value of the num1 variable. Next I append to that the word and with spaces around it. Then I append in the value of the num2 variable. Then the word is, and then finally the total. If we go ahead and save this, hop over to our browser and hit refresh, we can watch the thing run. So let's say I want to add the number 1 to the number 2, and it comes back and tells me the sum of 1 and 2 is 12. Wow, that's some interesting math there, JavaScript. What's actually happening there is a problem related specifically to the data types. What I didn't mention to you before is that our prompt statements up here, whenever a value is entered into them by the user, just realized I forgot a colon right there. Whenever a value is entered by the user, whatever value they enter is returned and stored, not specifically as a number, but always as a string. So it doesn't matter if they type in their name or if they type in a number, whatever they type in is always going to be stored in a string. So the actual data type of the num1 variable and the num2 variable is string. Because it's string and not number, when we get down to our statement where we're trying to produce the total, num1 plus num2, what actually happens there is instead of two numbers being added together, we instead have two strings that are appended to one another. Thus, 1 plus 2 equals 12. Right? We could do the same thing again if we go and rerun it. Okay? Enter the first number, let's say I put in fire. Enter a second number, let's say I put in cracker. Okay? It tells me the sum of fire and cracker is firecracker. So all it's really doing there is appending two strings together. And that is all due to the data types of my two variables, num1 and. Now, if I actually wanted to correct this program so that it worked, we're going to find that JavaScript makes available to us a special type of statement called a function, which we'll talk about before not too much longer, called parseInt. Okay? The parseInt function will take a string and will convert it for us into an integer, which is basically a type of number, simple type of number. So if I pass the num1 variable and the num2 variable to the parseInt function, what will actually result is those two strings will be converted into integers. So I will end up with them in a numeric format so that when I use the plus sign right here, they will actually be added together and not simply appended as they were before. So let's go back and give that another try. Let's say 1 plus 2 is 3. Hooray, JavaScript, good job. If you ever want to play a little bit more with data types, there's a nice little function which JavaScript gives us that can be used for finding out what data type any particular variable or literal is at any particular time. Let me show you this little function here real quick, which is called the typeof function. I'm going to put a set of script tags again here inside my body, and then I'm going to do a document.writeLine. What I'm going to do this time inside the document.writeLine is I'm going to type typeof followed by another set of parentheses. Now the way this is going to work is I'm going to be able to put pretty much any value that I want to here inside the parentheses following typeof. The typeof operator will look at it, determine what data type it is, and then will return that data type as a string. The value, that string that's then returned from typeof, is what will then actually be given to our document.writeLine statement so that it'll be displayed on the page. What I'm going to do just to neaten up the output here a little bit is every time that I do one of these, I'm going to append a break onto the end of it. And since I'm going to do this more than one time, I'm going to go ahead and just copy that fairly empty statement at the moment, so that I can use it over and over again here as we play. So let's start off here inside the type of parentheses by putting in a string, hello. If I go ahead and pull this document up in my browser now, what it comes back and tells me is string, basically telling me the data type of what's inside the parentheses after type of, the value being passed to the type of function, is a string. If I do the same thing again, but this time I put in a number, 797, let's say, when I switch back over to my browser now and hit refresh, it tells me the data type of that value is number. We can do this with just about anything that we want. We could put in something like true and see that it comes up as Boolean. We could put in something like a variable that hasn't had a value set for it yet. We could say var x and then actually put that variable here, x, and it comes back and tells me that variable is undefined. All right, if we jump back over to our text editor again, we could actually go on and play with this a little bit further. We could do something like, say, document.writeLine x equals 9. Okay, any guesses what the output would be there? Okay. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and also put a break on the end of it. Let's type my break. Okay. If I come back to my browser and take a look there, it tells me that the output, the value that was actually spit out, was 9. Now this is the case that I was talking about before, where x equals 9 is an expression. The statement x equals 9 itself actually has a value. In this case, its value is the value that's being assigned, 9. So when I do a document.writeLine for x equals 9, the actual value of that expression is 9. If I come back and do another document.writeLine, and this time I just take a look at the value of x, we'll see that even though I had put the x equals 9 into a document.writeLine previously, it did still do the assignment. We did still end up with the value of 9 there in the variable x. We could do the same thing, basic thing with a type of function thrown in there. For example, if I said type of x equals 7, what will actually happen in this case is x equals 7, the assignment statement, the assignment expression will be executed, so the value of 7 will be assigned to the variable x. Its value then, the value that that expression represents, is what type of will look at, so it will see that the value of that expression is a number, and then the string that's returned from type of is what the document write line will actually print out, so we should end up with number. Very good.